This is a 2002 Porsche 911 Turbo, and it is one of the greatest sports car bargains in existence. It's fast, it's fun, it's reliable, and it's cheap for what it offers. And today I'm going to review this car and explain what I mean. Before I get started, be sure to check out Cars and Bids, which is my new online enthusiast car auction website for modern enthusiast cars. Live right now on Cars and Bids, we have some cool stuff like this, and this, and this, and this. They're all being auctioned live right now. If you're looking to buy or sell a cool car from the modern era, the 80s, 90s, 2000s, and up, check out Cars and Bids at carsandbids.com. I've borrowed this car from a friend here in San Diego, and I'm going to start with a little overview. Now, surely you know the Porsche 911, one of the most iconic long-running sports cars of all time. The 911 Turbo has always been among the fastest and most desirable versions of the 911, and that has always kept values high. Most 911 Turbo models, even older ones, are well past the affordable range for most buyers. But not this one. This is the 996 version of the Porsche 911, which was sold here in North America from 1999 to 2005, with the turbo model joining in 2001. The 996 has always been the unloved 911, primarily because of its styling. People don't like the headlights. They don't think it has the traditional, beautiful 911 look. These people are idiots. Well, actually, they're kind of right, because the headlights in this car are a little bit ugly, especially compared to the beautiful 993 generation Porsche 911 that came before this. But while a 993 911 Turbo is easily $100,000, probably well over, you can pick up one of these for half that. Actually, less than half, because the bulk of these are selling between $45,000 and $50,000. Just because it has ugly headlights. Half price for a modern Porsche 911 Turbo with all-wheel drive and a manual transmission and up to 444 horsepower. And today I'm going to show you why you should consider picking one of these up. First, I'm going to take you on a thorough tour of this car and show you all of the quirks and features of a great Porsche bargain. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug score. Alright, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the 996 Turbo with the primary complaint of most Porsche purists about this car, and that would be the headlights, which, as you can see, have a kind of distinctive, unusual shape to them. Now, when the 996 first came out, the headlights looked like this, with a little orange part in the bottom, and everybody thought those were terrible. People called them the fried egg headlights, like an egg had been cracked and the turn signal was the yolk and the rest of it was just kind of runny, and they really were strongly hated. So Porsche went to these clear headlights just a couple of years later, which I think improved the look dramatically, but still it wasn't good enough for most purists who simply prefer a circular headlight in the front of a 911, just like tradition dictates, rather than this attempt at adding in another circle and kind of changing the shape of the whole thing. But this is the primary reason why the 996 is so cheap compared to other 911 models. The headlight design. It's hard to believe that something so relatively simple can have such a major effect, but it does. This is worth tens of thousands of dollars, and it turns this car into a real bargain. But anyway, since I'm up here, let's go through a few quirks and features of the 996 in this area, starting with the front trunk. Now, to get into the front trunk, there's a button on the key fob you can press, or there's a little switch in the driver's door jamb. You just pull on the switch, and that gets the trunk into this position. Then you kind of come up here, unlatch it, and you can open it up. Now, in my videos, I've shown you a lot of different Porsche front trunks, and this one is pretty similar to all the rest. Fairly large, enough size for some small bags. Nothing particularly unusual or interesting up here. You can see the CD changer in the front trunk where you would stick your CDs. That was probably a big thing in 2002, back when this car was new. Probably the most notable item in the trunk of this 911 comes on the inside of the trunk lid, where you can see this decal. Now, all Porsche models from this era have this label under here, and so do modern ones. And basically, it lists all of the options that were originally included in this car from the factory. All these little 3-letter and number codes stand for various options that were put on the car on the production line. The important one to note here is that this particular car has an option code X50, X50. That's a big one. And it's a big one because of the engine, which is, of course, back here in a Porsche 911. Now, while all of those other option codes probably meant stitching or climate control or stereo, whatever, the X50 option code gave the car more power. A regular 996 911 turbo had about 415 horsepower, but if you got X50, you got a revised engine computer, larger intercoolers, and larger turbochargers, and a total of 444 horsepower, about 30 more than a regular 911 turbo. And for that reason, X50 is considered probably the most desirable option on 996 turbo models. But adding that much more power was expensive from the factory, so very few 996 turbos have X50, but this one does. Now, when we're back here, you can really take a look at the engine and see just how stuffed it is into the back of this car. It's really completely jammed in there. There's not all that much space back here for an engine, but they get one in here anyway. Although this also shows why you really don't want to get rear-ended if you're driving around in a Porsche 911. The engine is just so close to the back bumper. Now, one major item worth noting when you talk about the engine in a 996 911 is something called the IMS, which stood for intermediate shaft. It was this bearing in the engine that would fail and destroy the entire engine. This was a common problem on 996 models, and it's another reason why people tend to stay away from them. Although you can replace the IMS bearing, it's kind of expensive, but once you do, you're generally okay for life after that. But the good thing about the 996 turbo is it doesn't have that problem. That issue only exists on most of the naturally aspirated 996 models, but the turbocharged one had a different engine design and does not suffer from the IMS failure. So if you've considered buying a 996 911 and you've decided not to because you're worried about IMS failure and engine failure, which is a reasonable worry, consider a turbo model instead. It is not a concern with this engine design. And from there, moving on to some other exterior quirks, one of the most interesting to me is actually the brake light design, which no one talks about with this car. Everybody talks about the headlights, but I've always found it kind of strange that the turn signal is so massive. The vast majority of this whole tail light assembly is turn signal. And in fact, you can see when I put on the brakes, the brake lights are far smaller than the turn signal. In fact, I think the brake light has about a third of the surface area that the turn signal does. It's not too common where you see a turn signal that's 3 times the size of a brake light, but that's the situation here. And finally, before I move inside to go over the interior quirks and features of this car, I want to talk about the styling. Okay, I get it. You don't like the headlights. That has become the in thing to say for Porsche owners who have a more expensive model than the 996. And they just love, oh, the 996 with its headlights. It's one of the main reasons I find a lot of really deep Porsche enthusiasts to be completely insufferable. But anyway, aside from the headlights, look at this car. Are you gonna really tell me that this is not a beautiful car from basically every angle but the front? It is a gorgeous look, a gorgeous shape, and in my opinion, far more attractive than the more bloated, kind of weirdly overhangy 997 model that came later. A lot of Porsche enthusiasts consider the 997 a return to Porsche Porsche's classic form, but I always felt the 996 had a bolder, more aggressive, cooler look. And if it hadn't been for those headlights, I really think this would be hailed as one of the more beautiful 911 models in existence. I really do. And next up, we move inside the 996, but before we do, I want to talk door panel, because there are a couple of interesting quirks on here. One, it doesn't look like you have any door panel storage, except you flip up this lid and you do. It's just covered door panel storage, which is a nice little privacy addition in this car. And next up, moving on to the door pull, you can see on the very front of the door pull, there's this little hole, little circle. What exactly is that? There's a little light bulb in there that is pointing forward at the driver's cockpit area and provides a little ambient light in the interior. I am always interested in areas where automakers hide ambient lighting throughout the cabin, but usually it's not all that interesting. They tend to put it in the same places, but this is an unusual one, hidden in the door panel, kind of pointing forward, providing ambient lighting at night. Very strange placement, but that's what it is. And next up, we move inside the 996 Turbo, where I should mention another complaint of Porsche purists about this car. They don't like the headlights and they don't like the interior. A lot of Porsche enthusiasts think this was a cheap, kind of crappy interior. It just didn't look up to par for the 911, and that's another reason why people reject this car compared to other 911 models. Now, frankly, I agree with that criticism. It is not all that nice in here. A lot of plastic, nothing really looks great, especially compared to how 911s look now, but this was an improvement on this car's predecessor. If you get into a 993 911, you can see the interior is just not all that nice in that car either. And at least the 996 has a more cohesive overall design rather than just like panels kind of stuck in place like the 993 did. It's also worth noting that the 996 is a 20-year-old car, and this is pretty much just how interiors looked back then. Take a look at the Ferrari 360, which was a competitor to the 996 Turbo at the same time period. The Ferrari's interior is way worse than the Porsche's. I would much rather be in the Porsche's interior. That's just how car interiors looked back then. And yes, this isn't up to modern standards, but nothing from 1999, 2001 really is. You just kind of have to live with it. But anyway, moving on to the quirks and features of this interior, one rather interesting quirk is the adjustment of the heated seat control. All right, you have heated seat buttons in the center console. They look pretty standard. You press it and it turns on the heated seat. But you press it again and the little light turns from red to orange. You keep pressing it and you just cycle through between red and orange. So what exactly is going on here? Well, the answer is red is the highest level of heated seat and orange is the low level of heated seat, and you can just press the button and cycle between those two levels. Most cars, they have two different lights for the heated seats. When both lights are on, you're on high mode. When just one is on, you're in low. But in this car, they went with two different colors for some reason. But anyway, you're thinking, all right, well, you keep pressing it and the lights keep changing. How do you turn these things off? And the answer is you press the other side of the heated seat button and that turns them off. It's a rather unusual control, complicating a fairly simple process, typical of the Germans. But even more unusual than that is definitely the climate controls. All right, you can have the climate control in automatic mode and then it will just get the interior to the temperature that you desire. A lot of cars have that. But if you start adjusting it yourself, you can see you've put it in manual mode, except it's actually in manual mode with an E and two L's. That is not how you spell manual in English. It must be the German spelling, but I think that's one of the strangest things I've ever seen. You know, they had conversations at Porsche saying, we really ought to translate this, but then other people said, you know, it's close enough. They'll figure it out. We're just gonna leave it. And I wonder how many letters would have had to have been different for them to have decided, okay, fine, we will translate it. It is such a strange thing to leave the wrong spelling just because it's close enough. Not the typical Porsche attention to detail. And next up, another interesting control in this area. On the left side of the center control stack, you have a little switch for the rear spoiler. You can see if you press it on the left, it will raise. If you press it on the right, it will lower. The spoiler will also go up at a certain speed to provide more downforce, for example, for racetrack driving, or if you just want it up all the time, you can do that by pressing that button. And next up, another interesting item in this interior is in the gauge cluster. This car has one of the earliest gauge cluster screens, only 2 colors, but you can use this little stalk coming off the steering wheel to scroll through various different items, and it'll show you pieces of information about the car and the current situation and give you various different displays. This is the early predecessor of the full gauge cluster screens we're now starting to see in most luxury and expensive vehicles. And next up, moving on to one of my very favorite labels in any car, and that would be in the driver's footwell. You have an image of a battery and then a question mark and then an image of a front trunk. I love that little mental walkthrough. Battery? Where? Front trunk. It's a great way to do it, and by using pictures instead of words, they don't have to translate it into a bunch of different languages when they sell this car in different markets, and that's why they've done it that way. It's kind of funny to see. And next up, a rather curious item in here. The center console has a little storage area. You press this little lock down, it opens up, and you can stick stuff in there. But you might be thinking, why does the center console lock? After all, we have a glove box which also locks, so how many lockable compartments do you need in here? Well, the answer is there was no glove box on earlier models. The glove box was added for the 2002 model year. And so if you wanted to lock stuff in your interior before this, you would use your lockable center console storage area. When they added the glove box, they made that lockable as well, of course, because glove boxes are, but they figured why bother getting rid of the lockable center storage area? So they didn't. And just in case you were still concerned about interior storage, good news, there's an entire section in the owner's manual devoted to helping you find interior storage compartments. And it goes through all of the possible places where you could put stuff in case you run out of interior storage room. I've never seen such a comprehensive list of interior storage options, but I guess they felt it was necessary considering they want to make this car as practical as possible for a sports car. And by the way, speaking of the owner's manual, it also comes with a dealer directory. This was the Porsche list of dealerships as of when this car was sold new in 2002. Nothing unusual about that. That's included with most new cars. The strange part is, at the very end of the dealer directory, there is a metric conversion chart. I don't know why they put that there. It almost seems like they forgot to include it in the owner's manual and they said, hey, well, let's just stick it in the dealer directory. And so that's what they did. But it's not too common that you see a booklet that's both a dealer directory and metric conversion chart. A nice versatile little inclusion in the 996 Turbo. And finally, we move on to the last interesting area of the 996 Turbo, and that would be the back seats. Now, getting into the back seats is kind of a cumbersome process. You first have to lift up this little latch on the front of the front seats and pull it forward. Then you lift up this little latch on the front seat backrest and pull it forward, and then you can climb in. Now, I have moved the front seat all the way forward already. I'm gonna lift up the backrest latch and then try to squeeze myself into this back seat. Oh, it is tremendously small back here, and with me sitting back here, you can't even come close to latching the front seat in place so someone could actually drive this thing. The back seats are really tiny, but I use the term back seat loosely because if you look, you just have kind of a leather seat bottom and then like half a leather backrest with some carpeting in between. It's not really full back seats back here. I guess this is all they could fit. Now, as you can imagine, there's nothing interesting at all in these back seats because they're not really designed for frequent use. Only small children or adults in an absolute pinch for a short period of time. The most interesting thing about these back seats is that they fold down. You can pull on this little latch, fold the back seats down, and then you have a flat storage area back here in case you want to carry larger cargo items that wouldn't really fit in place on the normal contours of the rear seat. So that can be useful to have. Anyway, now it's time to climb out of the back seat. Oh, I'm never going back there again. And so those are the quirks and features of the 996 Porsche 911 Turbo. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the 996 Turbo. Now I actually owned a 2001 model of this car about 8 years ago. No glove box. And I loved it, and I thought it was really cool, and it was a bargain back then. I paid $34,000 for it. I had to put a new clutch in, and I sold it for about what I paid for it. The prices on these have definitely been coming up. There's no question about it. I've done now 3 videos on the 996. I did a 4S, where I also called it a bargain. I did a GT2, which remains one of my all-time favorite Porsche models, and now I've done this one. And it's really hard to decide which is the better of the cars. But between the 4S and the Turbo, it's a tough call. The 4Ss are way cheaper, like 30 grand, and they're really well balanced. But the Turbo obviously has a lot more power, and it's more reliable because it doesn't have the IMS problem. It's just kind of a pick what you can afford. If you can get a 4S, get one. Just make sure IMS is done. If you can get a Turbo, get one. Any 996 is just a total bargain. And to me, the best thing about the 996 is and will always be the way that it drives, because it drives like a Porsche. It drives well, it handles well, it steers well, and the Turbo is fast. This is just pulling so hard. Woo! That is a speed that I can't mention on the camera. Slightly higher than the speed limit. It pulls so hard, whether you're going 0 and you floor it and it pulls hard, or you're going a 90 and you floor it, it pulls hard. The Turbo is just woo-hoo! Bye-bye, everyone. So quick. And like all Porsche models, the clutch and the shifter just feel great. Really, really nice to use. The clutch is very linear, easy to tell where it is to make easy rev matching. The shifter is just wonderfully smooth. It's just so perfect. And that's the thing I like about this car. Yeah, I get the headlights aren't the most attractive. I never have found them that ugly, but fine. The interior, yeah, not all that nice. But given the money, this is quite an automobile for the price. It really, really is. And they've come up. Like I said, I sold mine for $34,000. The market at the time was like 34 to 39. You can find a pretty decent one. Now you got to spend between 45 and low 50s. It's still a total deal. 415, 440 horse if you can find an X50. What? That's amazing. And they're really quick, and they're really fun, and they're really fast. And I don't know, I'm a big fan of the 993, 911, but I've never owned one because I just can't bring myself to pay more money for what I truly believe is a lesser car in some ways. Ultimately, this is one of those rare vehicles where it's a bargain and it's good. Often you get bargains and there's a reason that they're cheap. You know, they're never as good as the original, the car you really wanted. But in this case, it is as good. It just doesn't look as good. And so that's the 996 Porsche 911 Turbo. I'm not sure what's a better bargain. One of these for 45 to 50 grand, or a 996 4S model for around 30 grand. Either way, they're amazing deals and amazing cars as long as you can get over the look of the headlights. And you can, to save tens of thousands of dollars. Anyway, now it's time to give the 996 Turbo a Doug score. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, I've always thought the 996 looks good, but I understand the criticisms, and I'll give it a 6 out of 10. Acceleration does 0 to 60 in 3.7 seconds, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Handling is sharp, and it easily earns a 7 out of 10. Fun factor is high, with good handling, great steering feel, and excellent acceleration, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Cool factor is only okay. These are still relatively common, and they're kind of seen as the okay Porsche 911. It gets a 6 out of 10 for a total score of 34 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. This has normal equipment for the time period, but not much by today's standards, so it gets a 4 out of 10. Comfort is what you'd expect, and it gets a 5 out of 10. Quality is fine, the interior isn't great, but at least reliability is improved compared to the standard 996, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Practicality is normal for a car like this, and it gets a 3 out of 10. Finally, value, and this car does very well here. These have gotten more expensive in the last few years, so it can't get a perfect score, but it's still an amazing combination of reliability and performance and handling and relatively reasonable pricing, and it gets an 8 out
out of 10 for a total daily score of 26 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 60 out of 100, which places the 996 Turbo here against some other performance cars from this era. It ties some big dogs like the E39 M5, the E55 AMG. Obviously, those sedans do better in the daily score, but the fact that the 996 Turbo hangs with them just underscores how good it is as an all-around car and as a sports car. And it really is one of the best sports car bargains.